Before Sauron, there was a master who made evil an art form, and his greatest creation was not a ring, nor a demon of shadow, but a living mountain of flesh and fire, whose fall would break the very peaks of the world. To compare Smaug the Golden to this beast is to compare a wildfire to a supernova. This is the story of the pinnacle of draconic terror, the ultimate weapon of the first Dark Lord, a creature whose shadow signified the end of an age. Ancalagon the Black. For over 400 years of the sun, the Great War of the First Age had ground to a stalemate. In the frozen north of the world, the Dark Lord Morgoth Boglier, the primal source of all evil, was held captive within his fortress of Angband. His Orcish legions had been broken, his strategies countered, and his power contained by the relentless watch of the Noldoran elves. These were the exiles, the high elves who had returned from the Undying Lands, their hearts burning with a righteous fire to reclaim their stolen jewels, the Silmarils, and to bring justice to the murderer of their king. From magnificent fortress cities like Nargothrond and Gondolin, and from a line of fortifications stretching across the northern frontier, the elven princes maintained the siege of Angband. Their warriors were the greatest of their time, their clean-shaven, fair faces youthful yet filled with the wisdom of ages, their armor gleaming with an inner light. They were a wall of valor and light against an encroaching darkness, and for a time, it seemed that wall would hold forever. But Morgoth was not idle. He was the master of corruption. He could not create life from nothing, but he could twist and defile all that existed, pouring his own malice into living things to create mockeries of their former selves. From the noble forms of elves, he bred the orcs. From the ancient spirit of trees, he may have forged the trolls. But these were mere foot soldiers. Brute force for a brute war. To break the siege, to shatter the hope of his enemies, he required something new, something born of fire, and endowed with a terrible intelligence. He needed a true weapon. And so, after a century of secret labor, Glaurung, the father of dragons, was unleashed upon the world. He was a great worm of fire, wingless and terrible, his gaze holding a hypnotic power to dominate the wills of elves and men. He drove the elven armies back in disarray during the glorious battle, the Dagor Bragollach, burning the green plains to a lifeless ash. Morgoth had found his weapon. Yet, it was a flawed prototype. In a later assault, Glaurung was met by the host of Fingon, High King of the Noldor. The elven archers on horseback rode in great circles around the beast, their arrows peppering his iron scales until he could not endure the stings, and he fled back to Angband. He was mighty, but he was bound to the earth. He could be surrounded. He could be contained. Morgoth, the primeval lord of shadow and flame, had conceived of the ultimate siege engine, only to see it thwarted by cavalry. The lesson was learned in the smoldering dark of Angband's deepest pits. Power was not enough. Terror was not enough. To truly dominate the world, Morgoth's evil needed to dominate the very sky. But Morgoth was not a mere smith of steel and stone. He was a master of flesh and spirit, and he knew his first great beast had a fatal flaw. It could not fly. How does a Dark Lord, trapped beneath the earth, solve the problem of the sky? For the next 2 centuries, the war raged on the surface. Great kingdoms of elves and men rose and fell. Heroes were born and died in glorious, tragic duels. The tales of Turin Turambar and of Beren and Luthien were written in blood and sorrow across the face of the land. All the while, the great dramas of the Noldor unfolded under the light of the sun and the stars. And deep beneath their feet, in chambers of unimaginable horror, Morgoth's true masterpiece was taking shape. He poured his will, his fire, and his blackest sorcery into a new generation of his children. The source of his creations remains a mystery of the elder days, for no chronicler dared to witness the process. Perhaps they were bred from the spawn of Glaurung, or from some other fell beast captured in the dark places of the world. But to them, Morgoth gave a new and terrible gift. He gave them wings. This was not merely a tactical improvement. It was a theological statement. The elves revered the stars, the creations of the Vala Varda Elentari, Queen of the Valar. They sang hymns to the constellations and drew hope from their silver light. By creating a host that could conquer the air, Morgoth sought to blot out that light, to own the sky, and to prove that no domain was safe from his dominion. He would create a living eclipse, a final argument against hope itself. He bred them for centuries, a hidden legion of winged death. Their numbers grew. Their size increased with each generation. Their fire grew hotter, their scales harder than steel. For 200 years this new terror was held in secret. While the armies of elves and men fought and died against orcs and balrogs on the ground, a new legion was breeding in the dark. A legion that would render all their walls and fortresses utterly obsolete. Morgoth waited. He was patient. He waited for the perfect moment. to reveal his final hand. That moment came at the end of the age. The pleas of the half-elven mariner, Eärendil, had finally reached the ears of the Valar, the angelic guardians of the world. Moved to pity, they amassed a great army, the host of the Valar, led by Eonwe, the herald of Manwë. The Vanyar elves, who had never left the light of Valinor, marched alongside the Mechaiar, spirits of divine power in physical form. Their arrival in Middle-earth was not a battle, but a cataclysm. The sheer power of their coming shook the foundations of the land. The War of Wrath had begun. It was a conflict on a scale the world had never seen, and never would again. The armies of Morgoth, which had dominated the north for centuries, were swept away like dust in a gale. The legions of orcs were annihilated. The terrifying Balrogs, demons of shadow and flame, were almost all destroyed in a furious confrontation. The host of the Valar broke through every defense, smashed the gates of Angband, and descended into the fortress hell of the Dark Lord himself. The war was nearly over. Victory was at hand. The soldiers of light looked up from the slaughter, believing the final blow had been struck. The age of darkness was over. But hope is the first victim of a master of despair. When Morgoth had nothing left to lose, he unleashed a weapon so terrible, so final, that it made the Valar themselves recoil in fear. From the broken peaks and the deepest pits of his fortress, Morgoth unleashed his last defense. The sky, moments before filled with the silver light of the stars, turned to a storm of blackness and fire. It was not a cloud. It was a tide of living things. For the first time, the world laid eyes upon the winged dragons. A whole fleet of them, a nightmare made real, ascended into the air. Their combined roar was a thunder that shattered stone, and their coming was a tempest of destruction that drove back the victorious armies of the Valar in ruin and dismay. The war was not over. In a single, terrifying moment, the tide had turned. The divine host, which had just been on the verge of total victory, was now routed, fleeing for their lives before the storm of fire. The age of darkness was not over. It was about to truly begin. And then, their master appeared. Leading this vanguard of winged terror was the greatest of their kind, the mightiest creature to ever serve the Dark Lord. He was Ancalagon, called the Black. His scales were the color of the void, his blood was fire, and his sheer size defied all reason. When he arose, the thunder of his wings created hurricanes. He was a living mountain, an engine of apocalypse. He was Morgoth's final curse upon the world, the culmination of all his hatred, malice, and unholy craft. He led his brethren against the host of the Valar, and for a full day and a desperate night, even the divine beings of the West could not prevail against him and his host. The most powerful army ever assembled was broken, its will shattered. All hope seemed lost, as the shadow of Ancalagon fell across the land, a final and eternal nightfall. But how? How could a single creature, however vast, hold at bay an army of angels? Was it simply a matter of scale? Of fire hot enough to melt mountains? Or was the secret to Ancalagon's power something far more insidious, a truth hidden in the very heart of his creation? To understand the terror he commanded, we must understand the mind of his master. Morgoth was not merely a warlord, he was a fallen god. He knew the nature of power, of spirit, of the very fabric of the world he sought to unmake. He knew that his enemies, the Maiar and the Vanyar, were beings of spirit given form, and he knew their greatest weakness. They could not be truly defeated by brute force alone. Their spirits would endure. So Morgoth didn't just build a weapon of flesh and bone, he created an anti-god. For centuries, as he bred the dragons for size and strength, he performed a darker work. He poured a measure of his own divine essence, his own corrupted Fëa, into his chosen champion. Ancalagon the Black was not merely an animal. He was not just a beast trained to serve. He was a vessel, a living, breathing extension of Morgoth's own will and despair. When the host of the Valar looked at Ancalagon, they didn't just see a dragon. They saw the face of their fallen brother staring back at them. His fire was not just flame. It was a physical manifestation of the primordial malice that had first sundered the world. How do you fight a living plague of the soul? How do you strike down a creature whose very blood is despairing? This was the true source of his power. He didn't just break their ranks, he broke their spirits. The divine light of the host from the west faltered before a darkness that was, in its origin, just as divine. For a day and a night, the world held its breath, as the greatest army in history was brought to its knees by the greatest monster in history. The age was ending in fire. Morgoth, from the deepest dungeon of his fortress, must have felt a flicker of that ancient, triumphant pride. He had proven his point. Creation was flawed, power was supreme, and hope was a lie. But even the deepest darkness cannot extinguish a light it does not know exists. A new light appeared in the sky, not the cold silver of the stars, nor the golden fire of the sun. It was a light of piercing brilliance, a light that seemed to sing. It was the light of a Silmaril. Eärendil the mariner, who had sailed the pathless seas to beg for aid, had returned. His quest was a success, but he had not returned to rest. The Valar had hallowed his ship, Vingalot, and lifted it into the oceans of the air, turning the greatest mariner of all time into its first celestial captain. And he was not alone. From the peaks of the Chrysagrim came the eagles of the king Thorondor, the mightiest birds that have ever been. They came as a storm of feathers and fury, their cries like knives in the wind, a living answer to the winged plague of Angband. The final battle of the war, and of the age, would not be fought on the broken earth. It would be fought in the skies of Middle-earth. The sight must have been beyond all comprehension. On one side, a dragon so vast he was called a flying mountain, the embodiment of a god's nihilistic rage. On the other, a single gleaming ship, piloted by a hero of two kindreds, bearing a jewel containing the last pure light of a world before the fall. It was not a battle of armies anymore. It was a battle of symbols, a duel of mythic absolutes. Ancalagon roared, a sound that was not a sound but a void of silence that crushed the air around it, and he ascended to meet his challenger. The remaining host of dragons wheeled around him, a black constellation of death, ready to swarm this intruder. But Thoron Fefidor and his eagles met them head-on. The sky became a maelstrom of claws and scales, of noble cries and reptilian hisses. But the central conflict, the eye of the storm, was between the ship and the great beast. Ancalagon unleashed a torrent of shadow fire, a river of darkness so vast it could have incinerated a city. But the light of the Silmaril, the light of the two trees of Valinor, was anathema to the darkness of Morgoth. The fire was cloven in two, washing past the tiny ship harmlessly. Eärendil sailed through the inferno, his face set like flint, his eyes fixed on his foe. This was more than a man fighting a monster. This was hope given a blade, refusing to be extinguished. But what if the Silmaril was more than just a shield? What if its pure, untainted light was a weapon of a different kind? Remember, Ancalagon was a vessel for Morgoth's spirit. And what was one of Morgoth's defining traits? His eternal, gnawing hatred and fear of the light he had marred. That light didn't just burn his scales. It seared his soul with his master's primal terror. Was he even fighting Eärendil anymore? Or was he fighting a memory? But this is where the histories grow strangely silent. For what was the Silmaril showing Eärendil? Was it only a weapon in his hand? Or was it also whispering? The jewel showed him the fire of its making, the pride and possessiveness that had doomed an entire race. For a heart-stopping moment, the Silmaril was not just a light, but a temptation. To wield such power, to own it. But Eärendil was not Feanor. He sought not to possess the light, but to serve it. He rejected the shadow of its creator, and embraced only its unsullied essence. With a cry that was both a prayer and a war shout, he drove his ship forward. Ancalagon, tormented by the light, blinded by a memory of a pain not his own, opened his vast jaws to swallow the star that defied him. But he was too slow. Vingalot, wreathed in holy fire, was not a ship of wood, but an arrow of light. Eärendil plunged the prow of his hallowed ship, like a spear of diamond, deep into the throat of the great dragon. The Silmaril's light erupted from within the beast, a sun born inside a mountain of shadow. For a long moment, there was no sound at all, just a silent, expanding sphere of white brilliance in the heart of the night. Then, Ancalagon screamed. It was the sound of creation breaking. The greatest of all dragons, the ultimate weapon of the Dark Lord, was unmade from within by the purest light of the elder days. He began to fall. All through the dawn and into the morning he fell, a burning comet trailing smoke and ruin across the sky. His fall was the final stroke of the war. The towers were broken, the pits were laid bare, and the power of Morgoth was shattered. The surviving dragons fled, scattered and broken. On the ground, the orcs and balrogs, seeing the ruin of their master's greatest servant, lost all heart and were swept away like dust in the wind. The War of Wrath was over. From the lowest pit of his fallen fortress, the Valar dragged Morgoth forth. He was no longer a Dark Lord, terrible and majestic. He was diminished, his power spent, his form shrunken and lame. He groveled and begged for pardon, but his feet were hewn from under him, and his face was hurled upon the ground. They bound him with the chain Anganor, which he had known once before, and thrust him through the door of night, out into the timeless void. to wander there until the final end. But the price of this victory was terrible. The fury of the war had been so great that the lands of Beleriand were broken and torn asunder. The sea rushed in, a great green wave that swallowed the ancient realms, drowning the battlefields and the graves of heroes forever. All that beauty, all that sorrow, now lay beneath the waves. A new age had been bought, but the old world was lost. And what of Eärendil? He could never again set foot on the mortal shores of Middle-earth, for he was bound to the hallowed light he carried. His fate was to sail the oceans of the sky, a perpetual guardian and a sign of hope to the new world. He became a star, the morning and the evening star, a light for elves and men in the ages of darkness that were still to come. The most beloved star, a promise that even after the longest night, the dawn will arrive. The first age of the sun had ended. It ended in ruin and sorrow, but also in victory. It was an age of gods walking among elves, of unparalleled heroism and unforgivable sin. It was the story of a great light and the great darkness that sought to devour it. And though Morgoth was gone, his evil was not. His lies, his malice, and his will to dominate all life remained, like a poison in the very soil of the world, waiting for a new servant to give it shape. The great tales are never ending. The first age is over, but the shadow is not defeated, merely diminished. In the second age, a new darkness will rise, a servant of Morgoth who is cunning and fair, and he will forge a weapon to enslave all the free peoples of the world. The story of the Rings of Power is yet to be told. To see how the world is remade from the ashes, and how the war for Middle-earth truly begins, subscribe to the _Silmarillion_Chronicles.